Shit necromancers say. Family advice. "Your uncle is here to see you," came the voice from the intercom. "Which uncle?" the interim CEO said back into the mic. He waited and there was no reply. Puzzled, he got up and opened his office door. The administrative assistant intercepted him before he could clear the doorframe. "I think your uncle might be sick," hissed the assistant. "His color is awful." In the middle of the outer room, the uncle stood, rocking side to side ever so slightly, as though it was hard for him to keep his balance. His color was indeed awful. "Now your color's draining too," said the assistant. "Are you sick? Is there something going around?" The interim CEO said nothing. His jaw went slack and his breathing became labored and audible. "Do I need to call a doctor or something?" asked the assistant. The uncle walked forward with tentative, unsteady steps. The interim CEO retreated into his office, his backpedaling equally unsteady. He tried to shut the door, but the assistant was in the way. "Is there something I need to know?" asked the assistant. "My uncle died last week," whispered the interim CEO. "Then we have your attention," rasped his uncle. The interim CEO did not reply. His uncle stared at him. A blank look turned into a frown. His uncle grabbed the nearest desk by the corner and flipped it, sending papers and computer peripherals flying across the room. "Now, do we have your attention?" rasped his uncle. The interim CEO nodded his head. "You know what you did," continued his uncle. "You will cleanse the text." "You need to leave." The assistant took up a defensive position in between the interim CEO and his uncle. The uncle took another step closer, brought up an arm, and in a sweeping motion tossed the assistant across the room. "Do you understand your task?" The uncle's empty eyes were now level with the interim CEO's. "Not really," whispered the interim CEO. "The text was not meant for the masses." The uncle spoke louder. "You will remove it before you can cause even greater harm. It will be removed, or we shall come again, and you will become such as this vessel." As he stopped speaking, the uncle collapsed onto the floor. "Is he dead?" asked the assistant, scrambling to stand up. "He's dead," said the interim CEO. "He was dead last week. He's dead now. Don't ask me to explain the last 5 minutes." Explaining the last 5 minutes. "And this is where he collapsed?" asked the man in the black suit. "Right there." The interim CEO pointed at the floor. "The paramedics said he was dead, but we already knew that. I mean, he'd been embalmed." "Cremation might be prudent," offered the man in the black suit. "If you have any say in the matter, that is. It's harder for ashes to move around, and they tend to not be able to grip and throw things." "Can you explain what happened here?" asked the interim CEO. "Does it really boil down to a physics problem?" "That's why your investor retained me." Mr. Lewis had a business card that read physics consultant, but that was something of an in-joke. Mr. Lewis consulted on matters that defied the laws of physics, things that sometimes went bump in the night and weren't spoken of in polite company. "There are a few possible explanations, so I'll need to get some more information from you, and we'll see about eliminating some possibilities." "Anything you need. This whole ordeal has been very unsettling. I need an explanation, closure, and I think I need a drink, too. Would you like anything? One of the perks of the startup world is getting to stock a full bar." The interim CEO gestured to a 3-tiered shelf of bottles along the office's wall. "Not at this moment," began Mr. Lewis. "Is that a black light under the bottles?" "Yes, it's a black light LED shelf. It's good for projecting an avant-garde image to investors. It makes us look creative." The interim CEO poured himself 4 fingers of bourbon and forced down a slug of it. "Your uncle's body left the cemetery earlier in the day." Mr. Lewis returned to the matter at hand. "Looks like he dug his way to the surface and walked over here." "Walked? I wouldn't call it walking. Staggering, maybe." "Fine. The body staggered over here, if that's how you prefer to interpret it. That part's all fairly standard for reanimation, zombie, possession. whatever you want to call it. All of those conditions have the body leaving the grave. What's a little more unusual is that the departed spoke to you.
Oh, it spoke all right.
The interim CEO threw back the rest of the bourbon and swallowed hard.
Whatever was speaking wasn't my uncle, though. My uncle never referred to himself with a royal we before. Does a man's personality change after death? Is that what's unusual? More unusual than a dead man visiting my office?
That almost certainly wasn't your uncle speaking. And yes, that's the unusual part. Zombies happen. Those aren't all that unusual in the greater scheme of things. A reanimated body speaking to you is a little more unusual. A reanimated body speaking with someone else's voice and making demands? That suggests control by the living. And that's not exactly a beginner's trick. It also doesn't mean this threat was originated by someone steeped in the black arts. I'm not the only person who consults, and it could have been conducted on someone's behalf. The real question is, who could you have pissed off badly enough to send something as personal as a deceased family member to deliver the message?
I don't know. I don't think I've even been here long enough to make any enemies.
Explain that.
I'm new to the job.
The interim CEO fished a cigar out of his desk. He paused to fumble with a triple-jet torch lighter and almost lit the cigar in the middle before getting a grip on himself.
I mean, my family's from here, but I haven't really spent any time on this side of the country in 10 years. I was hired to try and salvage this startup, and I've only been back a couple of weeks.
Fine. Let's start with the salvaging. What exactly does this place do, and what happened to make you need to fix it?
We're an online slang dictionary. People use us to find out what the new slang means, or the old slang. The site's slang records go back quite a long time. I suppose it's easiest to say I'm here because of performance issues.
And by that you mean?
Startups can be judged a few different ways. How many different people use an app, how quickly the number of users is growing. If the users aren't growing, sometimes investors start caring about how much money the app is making. That's the short version. The app wasn't growing very fast, and it wasn't generating much revenue, so I stepped in to facilitate more user growth. It was intimated that my predecessor was spending too much time pursuing niche markets that were too small to move the needle. At some point, they'll replace me with someone more permanent. I'm here to get things restarted.
Okay, so you're here to get more traffic. What happened to the old CEO?
Technically, I replaced the founder of the company.
Did the founder leave amicably?
Does that ever happen?
The interim CEO took a long drag off his cigar.
Founders tend to be a little paternal about it. The startup is their child, their life. Frequently, their sense of self-worth is tied up in the company. They almost always have a fit when their company outgrows them and it's time for someone with more experience in running a company to take over. It's usually worse if they weren't performing to expectations and someone has to be brought in to salvage the startup. It's bad for the ego. But salvaging startups is what I do for a living. This time, the founder wasn't actually around by the time I arrived, so I can't speak to mental state. Either the founder simply moved on, or the founder is too mad to talk to me. Nothing's out of the ordinary with either of those options.
So we can't actually rule the founder out as an instigator at this time. I can look into that later. Right now, let's focus on the demand that was made. Do you have any idea what this text is that they want cleansed?
The entire app is a text. I mean, some cranks complaining about the dirty parts, but then again, people complain about the lyrics apps, about profanity and hip-hop. You find what you look for.
This might be too literal. Let's see if there's a connection to the way the message was delivered. Let's look a few things up.
I can do that,
said the interim CEO, and he produced an oversized smartphone from his pocket.
Fire away.
What happens if you type in zombie? The app read zombie, one who follows without question. All right, how about ghoul? The app read ghoul, one who devours political news. So your app is like Bierce's Devil's Dictionary. Fine. Let's go further abroad. How about reanimation?
I
began the interim CEO. Are these instructions? He held up the phone, and the app displayed a numbered list. That's real, whispered Mr. Lewis. And yes, those are instructions, modernized instructions. The original text isn't numbered. What happens if you type in Goety? I've never heard, began the interim CEO. You wouldn't have, Mr. Lewis interjected. Think of it as a technical jargon for wizards and witches. It involves invocations. Let's see how deep this goes. Goety. Again, the app displayed a list of instructions. That reanimated body may have had a point. Mr. Lewis paused to exhale. This really is dangerous. Those are working instructions for 2 rituals, and if those rituals aren't performed correctly, do you have any records of who put that in your system? It's a crowdsourced app, began the interim CEO. You can't enter anything into it without the user being tagged. I already know that login, too. The founder put those in. And if it was no longer desirable to have those online, wouldn't the founder be able to delete them, or is that something the company has to do? Users have the ability to delete their entries, delete their whole accounts if they want. It would just be a matter of logging in and clicking a few buttons. Then it's not an accident those are still up. What other definitions did the founder add to that app? Can you show me the user record? One moment. The interim CEO fiddled with his phone. Resurrection. Divination. Binding. What does turgy mean? It's similar to a binding, but you really don't want to know the details. Look, Mr. Lewis was interrupted by a crashing sound from the outer office. As Lewis and the interim CEO peered out the office door, they discovered they had a visitor. A visibly decayed body was overturning furniture and moaning. I think I will have that drink, said Mr. Lewis. 151. Give me the whole bottle and a lighter. 151 is a little down market to convey prestige. We have Appleton 21. It's very nice. I need something stronger. Chartreuse. Green chartreuse. Is that upmarket enough? Of course, he said, backing up to the bar. He handed over a bottle of green chartreuse without further comment. And the lighter? Mr. Lewis took the chartreuse and the lighter and stomped over to where the decomposing body was trashing the outer office. He held the bottle aloft with his right hand and brought it down hard under the dead thing's clavicle, breaking the bottle and showering its shoulder and chest with herbal liqueur. In his left hand, he ignited the lighter, turned up the strength of the jet, and jabbed it at the thing's chest until the chartreuse ignited. Then he kicked a leg out from under it. The still-moving body fell over. The remains of the clothing it wore were combusting. Fire's good for cleansing, isn't it? Mr. Lewis spoke to the body, hoping its masters were listening. Then he grabbed a notebook off a nearby desk and dropped it on the body. The notebook started to smolder. You, Mr. Lewis pointed at the administrative assistant. I need a couple reams of paper. Quickly. They were brought, though perhaps not quickly enough. Lewis ripped one open and started dropping them in small batches, using it as kindling to build the fire and occasionally kicking the body as it attempted to rise. I think that was my cousin, stammered the assistant. Whoever's behind this is doing their homework, replied Mr. Lewis. Incidentally, what's wrong with your sprinkler system? Usually offices get a little wet when you start a bonfire. I don't think the sprinklers came online after the building was retrofitted, offered the interim CEO. I suspect our investor would refer to it as cost control. That sounds about right. Mr. Lewis rolled his eyes. This is not my first contract with your investor. Can I have my lighter back? Fine. Mr. Lewis dropped another fistful of paper on the burning body and then returned the lighter. Here's how we're going to play this. I'm going to keep this fire going until this thing stops moving. We're going to burn the reanimation right out of it. Then I'm going to go find this founder of yours and ask what's being played at with those necromantic slang instructions. While I'm doing that, you're going to go through that app and delete everything the founder uploaded that remotely resembles anything like what we just looked at. Anything that looks like sorcery or involves the dead. Get it off the servers. Torch the backups. I don't think our policy allows, began the interim CEO. Then make a new policy, snapped Mr. Lewis. You know why I'm here and who sent me. Just assume my words come from above. You're incurring liability having that information online. This thing I'm burning is the latest incident of corporeal liability showing up to do you harm.
It's not clear to me if you can also incur legal liability from this, but your investor does not like liability of any kind. Are you following me? I can have everything removed from the servers. Good. Additionally, it might be a good idea to barricade the door after I leave. If the founder isn't the one who sent this delightful messenger, I can't guarantee you won't have another visitor before I can sort this out.
The loneliness of the long-distance founder. It wasn't an impressive house as such things went, but the neighborhood made it expensive enough. 2 stories with a stoop and a narrow frame. A paint job that needed some touching up. In the back was a small yard with overgrowth that could have been a garden had someone bothered. It was in that yard Mr. Lewis found his wayward founder playing with a dead frog. "Rise and be whole!" exclaimed the founder with all due gusto. The frog didn't move, just like dead things usually don't. The founder stared pensively for a moment, then produced a piece of chalk and drew a circle around the frog. "The breath of life greets and lifts you!" shouted the founder, arms waving in the air. The frog still wasn't moving. "I don't think you're following the directions right." Mr. Lewis spoke softly and watched the founder jump. "You're drawing a circle with chalk instead of salt. The chalk is for the runes outside the circle. You skipped that part entirely. Most importantly, you don't yell the breath of life into it. You pucker up and blow into it, like CPR. The founder frowned a moment, then picked up the frog, puckered up, and blew air into the frog's mouth. The founder almost dropped the frog in the process, yet the frog still did not stir. "Okay, I confess," chuckled Mr. Lewis. "I made up the bit about the breath of life. You really are new at this, aren't you?" "Who the hell are you and why are you in my backyard?" The founder's cheeks were flush, but the hiss was much quieter than the attempts at incantations. "I'm here to try to clean up your mess," beamed Mr. Lewis, laying it on a bit too thick. "We need to have a chat about what you were trying to do just now, and what you left on the servers at your startup." "My former startup," barked the founder, redder still, throwing the frog to the ground. "The investor made it perfectly clear I have nothing to do with that anymore. I never should have taken venture capital. I was deluded right out of ownership and shown the door." "Let's take it down a notch. There's a real problem with what you put on that server, and if you don't fully understand what you're starting with that, then you don't understand you've broken the rules and the powers that are coming for you. These are heavy hitters, and if they come in force, there's only so much I can do about it. You clearly don't have any experience with necromancy. So what are you doing fooling around with it? And why were you posting rituals on a website?" "It's not a website," growled the founder. "It's an app that happens to have a website." "Let's not get any more pedantic or I'll forget I'm trying to help you here," groaned Mr. Lewis. "You seem a little young to be caught up in this. How old are you, anyway?" 20. "And you were apprenticed to a necromancer when you were let go?" "No, I was running my startup for the last year and a half." The founder's eyes rolled like a boss. "You know how it works. You drop out of college, start a company, sell the company in 18 months. Instead of the company selling, I got sold out." "What, just a pure tech play? I don't see where the occult factors into this." "It's a demographic." The founder paused to step on an ant that crawled out of the grass. "The app user base stopped growing. We plateaued. I was under a lot of pressure to grow the number of users. Grow or die. So I picked up some old books and started transcribing them. You know, appeal to new niche demographics. I had the magic books. I had some polo books. Can you believe there isn't a bigger audience that's hungry for polo slang? It's tragic, but it didn't work. The app didn't grow. 18 months of my life wasted. Now I have to start over. No, really, I'm not bitter." "And when you were trying to blow life back into the frog?" "Telemedicine." "You're going to put a video of reanimating the frog online?" No. The founder was legitimately excited for a change. "Online healthcare is getting lots of investment money right now. If the chanting actually works, then I can digitize it and patent it and then sell it online. Do you know how valuable resurrections could be during an outbreak? No doctors, no hospitals, no overhead, just a server and the patient's credit card." If you got the spell out of a book, isn't that what the lawyers call prior art? I don't think you can patent something that already exists. And that is why you raise enough investment money to hire good lawyers. The founder was growing manic. It's not something you have to worry about if you can outspend whoever's challenging your patent. Yeah, let's talk about that. Somebody's already challenging your patent. That's crazy. The founder paused to step on another ant that had climbed out of the grass. You can't challenge something before it's filed. Wait, did somebody file a patent before I can figure out how this works? No. Mr. Lewis stared down at the founder and frowned. A successfully reanimated body trashed your old office. Twice. The founder was quiet for a change. The first time, Mr. Lewis continued, somebody spoke through the corpse and demanded that your successor cleanse the text. Are you following me? You're not the only one with a spell book, and that's a community that values secrecy. Do you think you might have attracted some attention you can't handle? You're joking. I'm not. Then what did the corpse say the second time one trashed the office? Nothing. I lit it on fire before it had a chance to talk. The founder stared at Mr. Lewis for 2 long minutes, looking for a smile or another sign of a prank being played. There was no such sign, save for the slight raising of a mildly annoyed eyebrow. The first one spoke? The founder's voice had doubt for the first time. That's right. And you made whoever reanimated it, probably multiple people that reanimated it, angry. Is your clue light coming on yet? I need some answers about where you got those spell books. I thought I already killed those ants. The founder was staring at the ground and 2 ants had crawled up out of the grass. The founder raised a foot and stomped on them, grinding the heel to ensure the deed was done. It would be very hard for you to have killed them, came a small, deep voice from behind the founder and Mr. Lewis. The pair whirled, but no one was there, and then they noticed movement on the ground. The dead frog was picking itself up where the founder threw it and rocking back into a sitting position. Take another look, instructed the frog. The ants were already dead. Back up, ordered Mr. Lewis as he retreated a step, but the founder paid him no heed. Upon closer examination, the ants looked desiccated. Not all of their legs worked, but the ants stumbled forward anyway. Dead ants were coming to the surface with increasing frequency. Time to leave, yelled Mr. Lewis, but the founder was frozen. The ants sped up and climbed atop each other, forming a pulsing curtain between Mr. Lewis and the founder. I wouldn't touch the ants, said the frog. Siafu ants are known for their bite, and they haven't fed since they were alive. The text is being cleansed, shouted Mr. Lewis through the wall of ants. They're deleting everything off the servers. You don't need to do this. On the other side of the curtain of ants, the frog hopped onto the founder's foot. The founder stayed frozen. You understand our wisdom is not meant for the unwashed masses, the frog said to the founder. It was not a question. The founder said nothing. You understand that accidents happen when novices play games with such knowledge. Again, the frog was not asking a question. The founder said nothing. You will tell us who you stole those tomes from. The frog grew irritated. The founder said nothing. You will tell us where you are keeping those tomes. The frog hopped backwards off the founder's foot. Information wants to be free, muttered the petulant founder. You can't contain information that's been released into the wild. Information wants to be contained, said the frog. Information belongs to those who can understand it. You, especially, can be contained. And you will be contained before your reckless attempt to profit off the hidden knowledge causes a plague of the undead. You play with unleashing a zombie horde to devour humanity with your ignorance. So shall you be devoured. The curtain of ants fell on the founder, and what mandibles were left on those ants started chewing. It took about 5 minutes before the founder stopped screaming. There was enough meat left on the bones for the body to be almost recognizable. The final blow was dealt by ants eating their way through the ear canal into the skull cavity. Was that absolutely necessary? Mr. Lewis asked the frog. You're no virgin, replied the frog. You know that examples must be made when a protocol breach of this magnitude has occurred. So be it, sighed Mr. Lewis. I acknowledged the problem and was attempting to contain it. The kid wasn't my client, just someone with more ambition than experience. Do we have a beef?" "You have understood the gravity of the situation," said the frog. "You have taken the initial steps to contain, even if you were slow to deal with the instigator." "Never mind what I do or do not find an appropriate punishment. It was not my place to be an executioner today." "True. The punishment is more official if it is we who make the example."
"Is there going to be a problem between you and my employer?" asked Mr. Lewis.
"Will the text be cleansed?" asked the frog in return.
"The parts they control will be. You saw whose doing this was. Steps will be taken."
"And the parts they cannot control?" asked the frog.
"We may have all gotten lucky here." Mr. Lewis attempted to sound reassuring. The knowledge wasn't uploaded to a popular website. It was a crappy little app with a crappy little website. It's not immediately clear the website was popular enough to be backed up. Most people wouldn't know what they were looking at in the context of a slang app. There's every chance it wasn't even noticed in the first place.
"Will you ensure they cleanse the text?" asked the frog.
"I am retained to resolve the situation," said Mr. Lewis. "I don't want necromantic rituals floating around for the public to mangle any more than you do. What can be done will be done. My client wants no trouble and already severed ties with the deceased."
"We will call it a truce for the time being," said the frog. "Go and see to the cleansing. We would dislike having to make a more public display, so all would be well if it were handled quietly. If you locate the tomes, bring them to this spot. We will know that you left them. Otherwise, we shall start looking for them ourselves. This rabble really isn't worth the time and energy to reanimate for such simple questions."
A line of dead ants marched in the direction of the founder's house to start that search, leaving a trail of blood behind them as though they were drawing a line from owner to property. Mr. Lewis took care to keep his shoes clean as he left the backyard.